Hello, BISC132. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 3.5. Continuing on with invertebrates. We're going to finish up, I promise. So last time we had started talking about arthropods, and we'd gotten to the point where we were going through specific subphyla. So up next is Subphylum Hexapoda. So Poda means foot. We've seen this many times. Hexa, like a hexagon that has 6 sides. Hexa means 6, so 6 foot. These are insects. And I said that arthropods is the largest phylum of all animals. This is the largest subphylum within Arthropoda. So obviously there's a lot of stuff here. I want you to be familiar with these if you're not already as insects: ants, beetles, cockroaches, butterflies, crickets, and flies. And again, that's not naming all of them, just some of the more prominent ones. They're known for having 3 tagmata. We mentioned this in the sort of generic arthropod, which turns out to be a hexapod: the bee, head, thorax, abdomen, and many of the members have wings. So yeah, I didn't see any crustaceans with wings, or spiders with wings, or centipedes with wings, but wings are something that we definitely see in a lot of hexapods, and that's part of the secret to their success, being able to live in all these other different ways that we couldn't see in the other subphyla. And another thing that we see a huge diversity among hexapods that allow them to be such a large subphylum has to do with their mouth parts. Don't sweat the details down here, but what this is, showing in kind of a color-coded fashion is, again, the secret to success is taking a body that is modular and has lots of different parts that can be modified to do different things. So, you can take these same basic mouth parts and create a mouth that's good at siphoning up nectar, like a bee, or great at lapping up, chewed up grass stuff, like a grasshopper, or, with long maxillae in order to get nectar deeper within a flower, or piercing skin to get blood like a mosquito, and of course many others. These are all just sort of illustrating the point that within subphylum Hexapoda, they've got mouth parts that can easily be modified for diverse feeding strategies. That's a great way to evolutionarily radiate out and speciate out if you can be modified to do a lot of different things. Another thing that's distinctive of this subphylum is metamorphosis. So all arthropods have to molt, but many of them just molt to grow larger. What we see in insects, in hexapods, is actually changing the form of their body and gaining new abilities or new parts during this molting. So there are 2 types. The complete metamorphosis is what we see in a butterfly, for example, where you have a larva form that forms a pupa and then comes out as an adult. It looks completely different. The other type of metamorphosis, called an incomplete metamorphosis, is where you have a series of molts where it's growing and changing a little bit each way, and as an adult it ends up being different from the first form, but it wasn't a single dramatic molt that changed things. For example, the grasshopper here has wings, and the earlier nymphs did not. So my summary here, many hexapods undergo metamorphosis as part of their molting in order to not just grow larger, but to actually alter their body. Okay, and with that, we're done with arthropods, and this is another, a major milestone here. We're done with protostomes. So we're done with this clade protostomia, which means all we have left now are these deuterostomes. And yeah, if you've forgotten this, protostomes were the mouth first, deuterostomes were the anus first. And then you go back to the last chapter if you want to have an explanation of this again. But yes, we are now moving on to superphylum Deuterostomia. So these 2, chordates and Echinodermata. So much smaller than protostomia, but as it turns out, this one's going to be bigger than it looks. Anyway, so clade deuterostomia, these are called deuterostomes, and yes, I can safely say this is going to include all further groups that we will talk about. Let's start with The echinoderms with phylum Echinodermata. So clay Deuterostomia, phylum Echinodermata. This is going to be sea stars, or starfish, if you will, brittle stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, yeah, all this stuff. So sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and brittle stars. They are, and I can, a lot of times I have to say, oh, they're mostly this or they're primarily this, because it feels like there's an exception all the time, but you can confidently say every single echinoderm is not just aquatic, but marine. All saltwater, no freshwater echinoderms, no terrestrial echinoderms. So they found their niche. They are coelacanths. And what's interesting is, we've been breaking down in this table here coelacanths and pseudocoelacanths and acoelamates and everything. But what I'm pointing out now is that if you wanted to draw a circle around what a coelamate is, it would be something like this. So there are some protostomes that are coelamates and some that are not, and all deuterostomes, incidentally, are coelamates. But the point is that the coelom within Deuterostomia that we find in chordates and in Echinodermata, it evolved independently of the coelom in arthropods, which evolved independently of the coelom in these few Lophotrochozoans that are coelamates. So coelamate is not a clade. It's one of those paraphyletic groups because it's not an ancestor in all its descendants. So echinoderms are coelamates. The coelom evolved independently of the coelom in any of these other groups. Coelamate is not a clade. Okay, so go back to this. Remember we're doing deuterostomes for the last two, body cavity coelamate, and circulatory system closed. We'll get to that in just a minute, but before that, let me go back to this point. I had already filled this out. One of the things I said way back when we got to this point was that all further groups were going to have bilateral symmetry. Well, all further groups includes echinoderms, and if you remember, bilateral symmetry is supposed to mean, one plane down the middle dividing into mirror halves. And if you think about it, one of the most famous echinoderms, the starfish or the sea star, doesn't seem to have that. So it has what's called pentaradial symmetry. So what gives? What's up with that? Yes, they are members of this group Bilateria because they have bilateral symmetry as larvae. So here is a young sea star with very obvious, single plane down the middle, bilateral symmetry. It is as an adult that they develop into this pentaradial symmetry. So don't have to redo this phylogenetic tree. We're off on a technicality, and it makes sense. So some members have bilateral symmetry as larvae, but develop pentaradial symmetry as adults. So we've covered all our bases there in case there was any confusion. So let's take a look at their anatomy. So again, we're using a sea star as a generic example here, but again, there are other echinoderms. We're just trying to keep things simple here. One of the things we see in the sea star is with several of the organ systems, they exist in a central ring, whether it's the nervous system, or whether it's the digestive system, or whether it's this water vascular system that we'll talk about in just a minute, that exist in sort of a central ring and radiate out to each of the arms. So this is kind of like those segmented worms that had a little bit of everything in each one of their segments. Well, the sea star has a little bit of everything in each one of its arms, which is why if an arm becomes detached, ripped off in battle or something like that, it can grow into a new individual because it has a little bit of everything. It has everything it needs. So organ systems radiate out to the arms from a central ring. Another thing to point out about echinoderms is their skeleton. We've been talking skeleton in most of these groups. They have an endoskeleton. So if you see a sea star like this in a beachside gift shop or whatever, that's the skeleton of a sea star. Some of them, more gnarly looking than others, especially on, a microscopic level. This is a skeleton made of primarily of calcium carbonate. And again, this is an endoskeleton. It's the inside, as opposed to those exoskeletons that we saw with arthropods, which were sort of outer armor. Okay, now the water vascular system. So this is something that is, completely unique to this group and quite frankly kind of weird. So the way echinoderms move is through these tube feet. And the way these tube feet are powered is hydraulic pressure. So to go back to this anatomy here, here is, the water comes in this central part. It radiates out through these arms, and with small muscles, they can control how much of this pressurized fluid goes into these tube feet and how much, stays out of the tube feet in order to extend them and move them around and to crawl around. Now, that's not all. In addition to using this water vascular system for, moving, for locomotion, for grabbing prey and manipulating them, this water vascular system also functions as a circulatory system. So this is why I wrote closed. It's not a traditional closed circulatory system with true blood like we see in other animals that have closed circulatory systems, but it's unique, but it's probably more appropriate to call it closed than it would be to call it open if we're trying to keep things simple. So here's my summary of all that. Phylum Echinodermata members have a unique water vascular system. This is formed from the coelom, so they're using this body cavity to do this. It uses hydraulic pressure to power movement of these tube feet. It's used for locomotion and prey manipulation, and it also functions as their circulatory system. Okay. Well, that does it for echinoderms. Now there's just one group left, Phylum Chordata. And so it's actually at this point that we have to transition to the next chapter, which is entitled Vertebrates. Now, it's called Vertebrates, but we're actually not on vertebrates yet. We actually have to talk about chordates before we can get to vertebrates. So it's kind of a weird way to transition the chapters, but it is what it is. So, okay, what is a chordate? Well, chordates have these 5 features. I've highlighted one of them here, and only 4 of them are drawn. There are 5 features that are unique to chordates. One of these is something called the notochord. This is a flexible rod that supports the body that, in some members can form a skeleton, act as a skeleton, but in the basic chordate, it's just a nerve cord. So here we go. This is still clade Deuterostomia, Phylum Chordata. Members have 5 features, and this is sort of an important parenthetical point. All chordates have these 5 features at some point during their development. We're going to see it is very possible, and we see this within our own bodies, for these features to be lost, but they're all seen at some point during development, even if they're not present in the adult. So, okay, feature number 1, notochord, a flexible rod that supports the body. Okay, in addition to that, we have the dorsal hollow nerve cord. So this is a nerve, also dorsal here along the back. This is a nerve cord, and it relays information. This forms the spinal cord and the brain in humans, for example, but it doesn't have to be that sophisticated. Pharyngeal slits or pharyngeal pouches are located near the mouth, and these are used to help in filter feeding. This is definitely one of those features that has been lost, or certainly reduced in function. It is not used for filter feeding in humans, but if you look at embryology, if you look at human embryos, this is present at certain very, very early stages, because just to let you know, humans are going to be chordates, of course, because we haven't come to ourselves yet. So pharyngeal slits, openings behind the mouth can be used to filter feed. And finally, the fifth feature, which wasn't labeled in this original figure, but I sort of drew a picture around it here, something called the endostyle. This is a mucus-producing tissue that also aids in filter feeding, and it's another thing that humans don't have apparent. Oh, sorry. Turns out I can't count. This was only number 4. Number 5 is the post-anal tail, a tail that extends past the anus. So this is another thing that humans have lost, but we have during our embryonic development. This post-anal tail extending beyond the anus. So we can also say, if we want to finally finish this table here, that chordates are coelomates, and we have a closed circulatory system. So that lets us finally finish out this table. And again, it seems like a phenomenal amount of information, but for most of these things, they're all bilateral except for a couple. They're all triploblasts except for a couple. The protostome, deuterostome is easy enough, and then it turns out to not be that much information about remembering which ones are acoelomates, pseudocoelomates, coelomates, and the circulatory systems of each of these groups. So this does not have any new information. Everything on here I've mentioned throughout last chapter and this one on these slides that have text. But this is just a convenient way, if you want to screenshot this or whatever, or draw this out yourself, to just organize all of this information. So now that we know what it means to be a chordate, onto the vertebrates, right? I mean, that's what the chapter is called, vertebrates. Well, actually, we can't get there yet. As it turns out, all vertebrates are going to be chordates and have these chordate features. But there are actually 2 groups of animals that are chordates. They are members of this phylum Chordata, but they are not vertebrates. They don't have a skull or a spine or things like that. So we don't want to call these invertebrates, because invertebrates typically refers to all of this other stuff, all the phyla that are not chordates, but we can't call them vertebrates either. So these 2 weirdo groups that are chordates but not vertebrates are referred to as non-vertebrates. Sorry if that's confusing terminology, but I don't make this stuff up. So what are these weird non-vertebrates? Well, one of these is Subphylum, and yes, it's a subphylum because this is underneath phylum Chordata, Subphylum Cephalochordata. Members are called lancelets because I guess they kind of look like a little lance, whatever. These look like fish, but if you examine them more closely, they're definitely not fish. They don't have any bones, they don't have a skull, they don't really have a well-defined head. They certainly don't have eyes or teeth or any of that stuff. They definitely have all the apparent chordate features. They got the pharyngeal slits, the postanal tail. They have the dorsal nerve cord and notochord, and the endostyle. They got all this chordate stuff, but they are definitely not vertebrates. These are filter feeders that bury themselves in sand or rock and filter particles out of the water. So not much to say about them. Subphylum Cephalochordata, lancelets, filter feeders, and these are one of those 2 non-vertebrates. The other group of non-vertebrates is Subphylum Urochordata. Members here are called Tunicates. And man, these things are weird looking. So this includes bluebell tunicates, and this looks like a heart at the bottom of the ocean. This sea squirt. These are really weird because this thing doesn't look like it has any of those chordate features. Certainly not things like the dorsal nerve cord. It doesn't look like it has a mouth and an anus, this sort of tube-shaped body. Well, that is because it has lost these features during its development. So if you look at one of these tunicates in its larval form, okay, you can see all this. You can see the pharyngeal slits here. You can see the anus. You can see the notochord and the dorsal nerve cord. It's as an adult that it takes on a very different shape and loses a lot of these features, but has the body plan that it has as an adult, and again is a filter feeder. So the larvae have chordate features. Most are lost in adulthood. They're filter feeders. Most of them are sessile, attached to rocks or something and filter feeding. But there are actually some really cool salps, is what they're called. Might be confused for a jellyfish, a sea jelly, but this is a chain of colonial tunicates that exist within the ocean, floating around and being a filter feeder. But either way, some grow in long chain colonies, but at the end of the day, they're still filter feeders. So, okay, those two subphyla were what we call non-vertebrates. Now we're on to actual vertebrates. This is a subphylum underneath phylum Chordata, Subphylum Vertebrata, also known as Craniata. And so, it's one of those terms that's sort of embedded, in our collective consciousness, that these are vertebrates. We should call them vertebrates. It's vertebrata. But as we're going to see, the cranium actually came first. So craniata might be a better name for this, but right now they're kind of used interchangeably. Members of this subphylum are called vertebrates. And again, the first evolutionary innovation was the head and the skull, which protects the brain. We definitely don't see that in tunicates or lanceolets here. And vertebrates, this subphylum, is going to include all further groups. So at this point, I want to introduce a new phylogenetic tree. I made this myself. It does not include everything, but it includes a fair amount of stuff. There's a chordate ancestor here, working up in a stepwise fashion. So let's start by talking about fish. Well, okay, where are fish? Well, there's bony fish, but these are some lampreys. These are also fish. Fish is a paraphyletic group. Fish, the things that we call fish, that is not a single clade. It is not an ancestor in all of its descendants. It's several clades that we sort of lump together. We exclude all the other vertebrates to create this group. So fish is not a clade. It's a paraphyletic group, but you can't not have fish. It's a term that still exists, even if it's not a clade. So most fish are ectotherms. So this is a new term at this point. It's defined within the key terms, sometimes colloquially called cold-blooded. The formal definition of ectotherm is an animal incapable of maintaining a relatively constant internal body temperature. So they rely on their environment for their body temperature, and we'll see this again in other groups, but just introducing this because it's the first time we've seen this. Okay, so the simplest of fishes is a group called hagfish. These are limbless, kind of look like an eel, but eels are going to be very different. These are limbless scavengers, and here's a picture that maybe shows this a little bit better. They'd have a skull, but no vertebrae. So again, the skull evolved first. So these are the most ancient living fish because they're at this primitive stage where they have a skull but not any vertebrae yet. These are sort of eel-like, just referring to their limblessness, scavengers. Okay, our next evolutionary innovation after the skull is the vertebral column, the spine. So we see this in the next group of fish called lampreys. Here's cartoon of a lamprey, here's some other drawings of lampreys, here are some terrifying photographs of lampreys, or actually that's a fish, there's the lamprey attached to it. And yeah, they do have a skull, they do have vertebrae, they don't have a jaw. So they have these teeth that they use to attach themselves to their hosts. These are all either filter feeders or parasites. So without a jaw, they can't really be hunters or or carnivores, but they can definitely be parasites and filter feeders. So lampreys have a skull and a vertebral column. And yeah, noting that these vertebrae, that's a replacement for the notochord. Again, the job of this is to protect that spinal cord, doing the bone here, doing a much better job of that than the notochord, sort of an extension or growth of that. And again, no jaw, we'll see that soon enough. Lampreys are parasites or filter feeders. Okay, so they don't have a jaw. You can probably guess what the next major evolutionary innovation is. A jaw. And so the clade that we're in now is called Gnathostomata, and this is a clade that can be called jawed vertebrates. So notice it's not jawed fish, it's jawed vertebrates. So the evolution of the jaw is something that happened in early fish, but it's something that's passed on from fish to all of their descendants onto amphibians, mammals, reptiles, birds. So this clade of Gnathostomata, jawed vertebrates, this includes everything to come. We are jawed vertebrates, obviously, with our jaw. So they have a skull, a vertebral column, and a jaw. And again, this is a big deal. The jaw enables for additional modes of feeding. You could chew up food. You could hunt prey more effectively. Yeah, this is big. There's a reason why virtually all vertebrates alive today have a jaw in one form or another. Okay. So our next group, again, we're under this umbrella of jawed vertebrates, is a class called class Chondrichthyes. This includes sharks, rays, and skates. These are sometimes called cartilaginous fishes because, I mean, you can't really tell by just looking at this skeleton, but it's made out of cartilage. We have cartilage, in our earlobes and in our nose. Instead of having a heavy bone skeleton, they have a more lightweight, flexible cartilage skeleton. So Chondrichthyes, cartilaginous fishes, sharks, and rays. So they're called cartilaginous because they have a cartilaginous skeleton, not made out of bone. It's lightweight, but it's not as strong as bone. So there are going to be some upsides and some downsides to this, and there's some reasons for this. A lot of these need to move to not sink. That means they don't have a good physiological solution to affect their buoyancy. So the way to not sink to the bottom is to keep moving. And in fact, a lot of these have to keep moving to keep breathing. These sharks called obligate ram ventilators. So they need to constantly be on the move. And if you have a really heavy skeleton, that's burning a lot of energy if you have to constantly be moving to either breathe or to not sink. So that's the reason for the lightweight cartilaginous skeleton, because again, it's definitely not as strong as bone, but it cuts down on the amount of energy you have to spend to move around. And yeah, a lot of them definitely have to move around to avoid sinking or drowning, essentially, if they don't get new water on their gills. So the light skeleton reduces energy spent in movement. There are some features here that we don't want to discount. Paired fins doesn't seem like a big deal, but this is definitely an upgrade over these limbless lampreys and the limbless hagfish. So having paired fins, one on either side of the body, is a big thing that we're going to see in pretty much all further groups as well. Most Chondrichthyes are marine, and as we know, most of these are carnivores. So this is a class. If we want to talk about the rest of fish, that's actually not one class. There are several different classes of what we collectively call bony fishes. So this is I'm not going to break things down to the class level, although the classes certainly exist. I'm going to lump together all the fish with bones into a clade called clade Osteichthyes. So these are called the bony fishes. And yep, they're named appropriately. They have a skeleton that's not made of cartilage, but is made out of bone. And again, it's the exact opposite of cartilage, which was lightweight but weaker. The bone skeleton is heavier but stronger. So this is accompanied by a couple of evolutionary innovations that help them, not sink. The weight of this heavy bone skeleton is offset by air in a structure called a swim bladder. Chondrichthyes do not have this. Only bony fishes have this. The swim bladder is an organ that is attached to the circulatory system. Gases can be put into the swim bladder or taken out of the swim bladder, allowing the fish to regulate its buoyancy, and so it can stay at a certain level in the water and not sink, even though it has a heavy bone skeleton. So this sort of goes together with the bone skeleton, the swim bladder, allowing it to maintain its desired buoyancy. Another feature that kind of goes with this heavy skeleton is a structure called the operculum or gill cover. So one of the things that we saw in sharks were, their fin or their gills, you can't see them very well here, their gills are just sort of exposed to the surrounding water. Many of these, like this shark, have to keep moving to expose their gills to new water. And of course, that takes a lot of energy to keep moving. And if you have a heavy bone skeleton, you want to avoid having to move constantly. The operculum or the gill cover is a cartilaginous flap that not only protects the gills, but has muscles attached to it so it can flap back and forth, circulating water over the gills, allowing this fish to breathe, to have new water exposed to its gills without having to swim around constantly. So this is also sort of related to the heavy bone skeleton, offsetting the weight of that by not having to move all the time. So members of Cladosteichthyes have an operculum or a gill cover that protects the gills and helps pass water through the gills. Now, there are, I think I said a minute ago I wasn't going to get into the classes. I lied. I'm not getting into all of the classes because several of them are extinct. There are two extant classes, meaning not extinct, that are members of this clade of bony fishes. The biggest one by far is class Actinopterygii. It's quite a mouthful, Actinopterygii. These are called, these include virtually all bony fish that you could possibly try to think of. It's going to be easier to remember the two bony fish that exist today that are not members of this class. Members of class Actinopterygii are called ray-finned fishes. Again, this is within Cladosteichthyes class Actinopterygii. Ray-finned fishes, this includes almost all bony fish alive today, and they're called ray-finned because their fins are webs of skin with thin spines. So here's a cartoon of this. Yep, there's one of the fins, and yeah, there's some bone here, but most of the actual appendage is just this flat, thin ray. It's not a very robust appendage. It works just fine for them. They're extremely successful throughout the planet, but yeah, their fins are pretty simple. In contrast, the other class of living bony fishes is class Sarcopterygii, and this only has a couple of members, a few species of lungfish and the Coelacanth. These are known as lobe-finned fishes. Very few living members, and obviously the difference here is in their fins. Instead of being thin rays, these lobe-finned fishes have much more robust fins, filled with bones, filled with their own muscles. The fins in ray-finned fishes are attached to the shoulder, basically, and they use shoulder muscles to move back and forth. Here there are muscles within the appendage, within the fin itself. So this is worth pointing out, and this is worth bringing up, these muscular bony fins possessed by class Sarcopterygii, because what we're going to see is these are the precursor to the weight-bearing limbs of all further vertebrates. So these are the ancestors to what would become amphibians, and then mammals, and then reptiles, and then birds. And again, you can track these synapomorphies, to go back to that term from the very first lecture in the quarter. The bones in these lobe-finned fishes correspond to bones of living land vertebrates, and other extinct links between them and the land vertebrates that exist today. Again, evolution is all about taking something that already exists and modifying it. And so if you have a limb that's filled with muscles and bones, that can be modified to form a limb that can bear weight on land, and that is what the evidence points to. So the fins of these Sarcopterygiae evolved into the limbs of all further vertebrates. And we'll talk about all further vertebrates in the next lecture. So this is typically my cutoff at the end of fishes before we get into the rest of vertebrates. This is the end of recorded lecture 3.5. This is also the cutoff for exam number 3. So we'll get into amphibians, birds, and mammals and all that fun stuff for the 4th exam. This is the end of exam 3 stuff.